KPMG India and Center for Maritime and Air Transport, University of Antwerp, Belgium. Last year, during a training workshop, I quoted a black swan moment involving Vale's iron ore production cuts and declaration of force majeure on iron ore contracts due to Brazil dam burst, which severely impacted the dry cargo indices. Frequent recurrence of disasters like the present pandemic makes us all reflect and ponder if we are fully prepared and have we built sustainable resilience for the maritime industry that we all are part of. To deliberate this crucial and challenging subject, we are extremely fortunate to have among us eminent panelists of diverse nationality from a cross-section of industry practice, academia, research, and consultancy. We have with us Professor Dr. Thierry Van Helslander, Captain Unmesh Abhyankar, and Mr. Samir Bhatnagar. Professor Dr. Thierry, his current designation is that he is Associate Professor at the Department of Transport and Regional Economics at the University of Antwerp. He is currently the course coordinator for the courses Management of Innovation and Technology and the Port Economics and the Business at CMET and Transport Economics at the Faculty of Applied Economics. He is the chair of the World Conference of Transport Research, Special Interest Group A2, which comprises of ports and maritime, and the topic area manager for WCTR's track A, which is of transport modes. He also heads the freight and logistics group within the European transport conferences. He graduated as a doctor in applied economics at the University of Antwerp. His PhD dealt with cooperation and competition in the seaport container handling. His past experience, he was director of the Research Center on Freight and Passenger Transport, hosted by Department of Transport and Regional Economics. Thereafter, he was the holder of the BNP Paribas Fortis Chair of the Transport, Logistics and Port. His research focuses on the business economics in the port and maritime sector and in land transport and urban logistics. But before I hand over to him, I would introduce the other two speakers. There will be an audience poll question, and then Dr. Thierry will start his presentation. Captain Unmesh Abhyankar, he is the joint president at Adani Ports and Special Economic Zones, and he leads the Business Excellence, IT, Techno-Commercial, Center of Excellence for Engineering, Planning, Technical Training, amongst many others. In a very short stint, he has been instrumental in effecting long-lasting changes for multiple sites at Adani Port and SEZ. He has been actively involved in shaping up the company's long-term vision and future direction. Prior to his current role, he was the CEO of Mundra Port, where he spearheaded the port's stellar performance in cargo handling. Qualified as the Masters Foreign Going and having undergone leadership programs, Captain Abhyankar has 35 years plus of working experience spanning across marine, cargo operations, leading teams and delivering outstanding performances. His major achievements consist of activity-based costing and standardized standard operating procedures, SOPs, which have unlocked the additional value for the company. During his tenure at Adani Port SEZ and Mundra, the port leapfrogged from being 10th largest port in 2009 to the largest commercial port in India today, surpassing all the other major ports. Mundra Port is the first commercial port in India to achieve 100+ million metric tons of cargo handling during a particular year. Mr. Samir Bhatnagar will be the next speaker. He is a partner for transport and logistics and global sector leader for ports at KPMG. He holds a bachelor degree in mechanical engineering from Delhi College of Engineering and the postgraduate diploma in management from IIM Lucknow. He specializes in the maritime transport. During the 7 years of career, he has worked with the Ministry of Shipping, Adani Ports, Paradip Port, Department of Government of Andhra Pradesh, DMICDC, Krishnapatnam Port, amongst the others. Prior to joining KPMG, Samir also worked with the Tata Strategic Management Group for more than 4 years as the project leader, where he advised the Tata Group in India and abroad for the new business and inorganic growth initiatives. Samir has traveled extensively all across the globe, and he has developed entry strategies, performance improvement programs, financial models, feasibility studies, and market analysis reports for the leading infrastructure clients in the private sector and government agencies for more than 15 years across the ports and shipping. So we all look forward to this eminent panelist to address the critical issues. And before I request Dr. Thierry to start his presentation, I would like to go to the first poll question. The basic question arises out of this, that there are various strategies which are adopted by the different industries to build resilience and sustainability. The question here is, to what extent is the present pandemic accelerating the innovations and technology implementation in maritime industry? You need to choose one of the 3 options and submit it. By the time the results come out, I would request Dr. Thierry to commence his first session. He will deep dwell on the past crisis of the maritime industry and take us through the technological adaptations which have become the determinants of the performance in the port sector. So over to you, Dr. Thierry. Please share with us your deep thoughts and knowledge about this.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can everybody hear me? I assume you can hear me?
We can hear you, sir. Please.
Okay, that's fine. Good, thank you. While the presentation is being put up, I welcome you on my behalf from till now still sunny Belgium, but we'll get some thunderstorms later this afternoon, it seems. I cannot see the presentation yet, but I guess that will be coming up very soon, I imagine. While we wait for the presentation to be shared, I think the opening poll question that was raised was a very interesting one. Indeed, we are living through very special times, and I will also come back a bit to those special times. So I would like to deal in this session with a number of determinants of performance in the maritime industry, and I will focus on 2 main elements about shipping and ports. Actually, 18 minutes is quite short to deal with a lot of these determinants. There's a lot of factors playing out there, especially these days now with the current environment, which also go wider than the port itself. And then the shipping or the maritime part, we should also look at the hinterland part, of course, which is also playing a role there. Just viewing on how to move forward the slides. Can anyone click for me to the next slide, please? Yes, so I'm going to deal with 4 main issues. The first one will be about shipping and port market characteristics of the current day markets. Looking at innovation, how has this sector dealt with innovation as a solution, among others also to crisis? Then looking at some future challenges. And to end, I will also provide you very briefly a tool or tools that could help in overcoming issues like we have currently now with the current pandemic, which is going on, and which should help us also to prepare for the future after that. So if we go to the next slides, then I've put in this graph to actually show you the complexity of the shipping business. And for the people who are in the shipping or port business, this will be no big surprise probably. But you notice that growth in this business is extremely volatile. It can be very high one year, and it can be much lower in the next year. Yeah? You will see here this big volatility in this slide. If you look at the trade evolution, and of course, trade is the basis for shipping and port activities in the end. If you compare that with GDP evolutions, we see that the trade evolution is much more volatile than the GDP evolution. We also see the impacts of specific effects. We see the impacts of the oil crisis, for instance, in the 70s and 80s. We see the impact of the 2001 terror attacks in the United States mainly. Then, of course, we see the big dip that we got in the 2008 crisis, but none was bigger actually than the current dip that we are these days observing, of course, with the current COVID pandemic, which is unseen globally in, well, we could say nearly the least 100 years approximately. So this is the framework within which the shipping and port business also has to work, of course. On the next slides, we will see a bit more in detail than for the Port of Antwerp. I've shown the impact that such volatile environment has on port traffic. And this is the example for the Port of Antwerp. I've taken it with as a main focus the 2008-2009 global financial economic crisis. And as you can see, that meant the first dip for the Port of Antwerp in a period of more than 20 years, actually. So it took quite a while before getting this dip, but it was quite substantial, as you can see. And as you will also see, the port did not really recover, at least as far as containers are concerned. These are TEU figures. The port did not really recover before the end of 2016. Yeah? So it took more than 7 years for the Port of Antwerp to recover from the big gap that was thrown in there by the global financial economic crisis. So you can already imagine what might happen, and it's still early to see that, but if we go on the next slide, we will see a bit more about that. But what might happen with the current COVID pandemic, of course. I see that the slide with the COVID impact was skipped, but that's no problem. What we actually see in the current day situation, before going into this actual slide, what we see with the current COVID impact is that we see a big drop in the number of ship calls. In the first place, we see this for the passenger ships, yeah, which are also important customers of seaports. We tend to forget about that sometimes. But ports are not only about cargo, they also are about passengers, of course. So that's where we see currently the biggest dip, because basically no one dares or is allowed to travel by sea anymore as a passenger if it's not needed. What we see on the cargo side is that the evolution is, well, not that extremely bad, but it's also not good. We have seen, for instance, that there was a dip in container shipping as a consequence of China's factories closing. In the meantime, most of these plants in China have started up again. So there is already flow coming from China again onto other continents. The problem is that the virus is now active in most of these other continents. So there are partial or full closures over there, which makes that traffic is coming to those ports. But in those ports, they pile up because there is nobody to take them onto the hinterland and to consume them, actually. There is much less demand. Shops are still closed, local factories are closed. People don't have confidence in the economy. Maybe they will lose their job, so they don't buy a lot of products. So all this makes that we have a whole sequence of impacts also on these ports. And we see that in most cargo trades, actually. We see, by the way, that currently the tanker business is hit a bit more even than the other types of maritime business, which is also due to the fact that quite some companies are still closing down in many parts of the world. So the demand for oil, for petrol, of course, is also much lower over there. Now, all this was context. What do we see then with this shipping and port business? Well, overall, we see, by looking at this slide, for instance, that this shipping and port business is quite resilient. One of the measures that the business has taken to remain competitive or become even more competitive is, for instance, a scale increase. And I just want to show you with this slide the evolution between the first container ship, remember the first container invented in the 50s by Malcolm McLean, and then the current day situation with the biggest container ships. Already today we have ships on the table which are bigger than these 22,000 that are mentioned there. So this is evolving. And honestly, as economists and even looking at engineers, my colleague engineers, we never believed 20 years ago that we would reach ship sizes of more than, let's say, 10,000 TEU for technical reasons, because everybody assumed that the ships would break at some point through parametric rolling, for instance, but also economically. We thought that in no port in the world, or only in a very small number of ports in the world, these ships would be able to enter, and therefore they would be hostage of just a few ports in the world. Plus, we never thought that there would be the capacity in the port, but also on the land side, to bring this cargo to the hinterland. Well, apparently all this has been solved to a large extent. We do have these bigger ships. Shipping business did not stop. The number of ports and terminals globally is still increasing. So this sector has really found ways to increase its scale and become even more competitive, become even more needed for international trade. Now, if we move to the next slides in this set, then we will observe that these economies of scale have also materialized in decreased costs. If we compare the cost of bringing one container, and in this graph, we look at a traffic going from Hong Kong to Antwerp. If we look at this, we see that the cost of transporting that one container with a smaller ship, which you can see on the left side, and compare that with the bigger ships that we have currently on the right in this graph, well, this cost of transporting this one container has gone down dramatically, has nearly halved approximately. These are calculations that we have made together with a number of colleagues at our department with a model that we have developed in-house. And what you can see by looking at the components is especially interesting the green component. And the green component represents the second one. They are ranked in the same order as you can see them in the graph. That means the green component is the fuel cost. So we see that the fuel cost for transporting one container has gone down dramatically, which is a clear example of economies of scale. And by the way, also a clear example of how the shipping business ensures that it becomes also greener. It becomes more sustainable, which is of course a big need in the current day environment also. So this is also one of the evolutions that we have observed. Now, if we look at the next slide, if we move on, we have a lot of positive evolutions. And here we'll need to click a bit. First, we also saw evolutions on the terminal side. You saw on the left side these straddle carriers. Then we saw these automatic cranes, terminal cranes coming up. And then on the right, you see these fully autonomous vehicles, which in a couple of ports in the world now, among others in Singapore, but also in Rotterdam, these are active. So we have today terminals where no person is operating anymore, no manual labor needed. Everything is done fully automatically. If we click on this slide, a number of figures will also appear, and you can keep on clicking. You will see that the speeds at which these vehicles are now traveling, but also the accuracy of these vehicles and this equipment in terminals is extremely high. So this sector, the port sector, but also the shipping business, has really managed to evolve into a more modern business using technologies and using them to become more productive, more efficient, more precise, actually. If we move on to the next slides, we also see a bit the downside of this story. Yeah? And by looking at this slide, what we see actually, what all the examples of innovation in the port and shipping business that we see here have in common. Well, I will come to that point immediately. I'll first pick out a few. The top middle one that you see is the double-sided terminal, which was tried out in Amsterdam, for instance, to operate ships from two sides, but it didn't work out because it was too complex for the loading and unloading schemes of the ship, and also too dangerous for the cranes to hit each other. What we see next to that on top right are foldable containers. Great idea, but not used in practice, because in the end, cargo still needs to move from one point to the other in the world. So if you take back empty containers, whether you fold them or not will not make a big difference. Yes, you will gain space, but on the other hand, the ship has the space anyway. The ship has to sail back anyway, so you don't gain anything really. So great idea, but it didn't really materialize. Yeah? At the bottom, you can see the small barge concept for the hinterland connections to ports, for instance. Great idea again, but it's not there yet. Yeah? And yet is important because it's under development. And we see it takes time, probably more time than people had thought at the moment that they developed this kind of thing about 15 years ago. So if we click one further, one common denominator for these innovations will come up. It is that they all failed or yet failed. They are not yet successful. Maybe some of them will become successful, but a lot of these concepts are not successful yet. So not everything automatically transforms into gold also in the port and shipping business. A lot of these innovation initiatives simply don't go through, they fail. Yeah? And that's also important to know, that not everything is works from the first time, of course, and is as positive always. If we go on to the next slide in this presentation, well, we come to some current challenges, and I think maybe everybody will recognize the, if we just go back one slide, please. Everybody will recognize the top figure with all these numbers that you can see there. It's of course the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, developed by the United Nations. Also, and in the first place, ports and the shipping business will need to comply with those. Yeah? Ships are still, in total, not per container, but in total, a very polluting mode of transport. Yeah? They emit a lot of CO2 and a lot of sulfur, especially, which is harmful. There's also quite some water pollution still. Think also about ballast water, etc. But we also have to think about other things. And if we then click through to the next slide, we come to some detail of these different challenges. First of all, environmental. So we think about emissions. And yes, globally, efforts have been taken to reduce, for instance, on the top left, you can see that the level of sulfur emissions with caps that have been put on to bring those down. And if you look bottom right, you will see a number of solutions that work better than others sometimes to resolve these issues also in the shipping business. You have different solutions which are there, LNG, scrubbers, voyage optimization, etc. All of them do some trick, but the problem is that today, not much of them is being implemented. There is not a lot of investment because there is a lot of uncertainty, supply and demand uncertainty, but also legal uncertainty. So this needs to be solved, of course. On the next slide, then we come to the social challenges. Also socially, and especially in these COVID times, there is a very big social issue, of course, with mariners not being able to leave their ships anymore, being stuck on the ships. So that's a very big issue. But there is also other issues. On this graph, you can see top left the labor evolution for the Port of Antwerp over the last 20 years. And what you see is that it didn't increase. Port traffic increased very strongly, but labor did not increase. We also see top right that there is becoming in the port area and also in the shipping business a middle income gap. That means what we are stuck with is, on the one hand, very well paid people, and on the other hand, very poorly paid people. That's again an issue, of course. Age distribution, bottom left, you can see the graph, the evolution of ages. And what we see is that typically in the port and shipping business, people are getting older all the time. So the young generations don't flow in as they could or should. And then lastly, on this slide, bottom right, you see also the gender issue, of course. Look at the Port of Antwerp. The majority of the people working there are male. It's only a minority who are female for various reasons. But again, it's an issue to take into account here. And on the next slide, then we come to some economic challenges. And I just pick out one here, a big one, which is the pressure which is being put on ports and on the shipping business, because we see that the investment in inventories is going down all the time at the benefit actually of transport. Yeah? That means all the time less inventories are being held into companies, and transport is becoming a real source of inventory, with the big issue of just in time that we all know about. And we all know what pressure that brings on also the port and the shipping business, of course. And then we come to the next slides, which will be the last one, which will be one of the tools that is key, according to us. It's forecasting. Yeah? Whatever pandemic is happening, whatever event is happening, you always need to have a number of scenarios ready. And this is an example that we calculated for the Northwest European port range with Antwerp, Rotterdam, and Hamburg. With the dotted line, you can see the capacity. And in the colored lines, you can see under different scenarios, the traffic evolutions. Yeah? From very weak, the blue line at the bottom, to extremely well, which is the red line on top. And what you see is that the demands for capacity, ports, but also ships, are extremely different in those two extreme scenarios. In the blue scenario, no need to further invest. The current investment plans would be sufficient. In the red scenario, you would quite soon, already 5 years from now, run out of capacity, which is a big issue that has to be taken into account. And that's why we are convinced that forecasting really is a key tool to be ready for the future in this business. And this was actually all I wanted to say here to you. So the last slide is just the concluding one, and also to thank you, of course, hoping you enjoyed this presentation. And you also find my contact details there at the bottom of this slide. So I gladly hand over the floor again to the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thierry. It was really enlightening to learn that while the technologies are required very much to be there and they do facilitate the acceleration to build a sustainable future, however, in itself, technology may not always be the only solution. We need to very much keep in mind the Sustainable Development Goals, which are providing a broader vision and a broader picture. I would now request Captain Unmesh Abhyankar to take us through to the current situation with respect to the maritime industry in India. And before we hand over to Captain Abhyankar, here is the question for the audience in the form of the audience poll. The question is, will the maritime industry be a leader or a laggard in the post-pandemic recovery? So please choose your answers, and let me request Captain Abhyankar to share his insights. Captain Abhyankar, please.
Good, everybody. I hope I'm loud and clear.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, I think Dr. Thierry has set the trend. Now, can you go to the next slide, please? Now, this gives the overview of the entire Indian maritime industry, what we are looking at, the global economy, how it affects the global maritime industry, then the issues and challenges faced by the shipping and logistics industry, then the initiatives taken by private ports. After that, the major learnings and support from the government, which we had actually expected. So can we go to the next slide? See, 90% of the cargo of the EXIM trade actually moves by sea. And if we are to look at the current situation that we are in, barring the Spanish flu, I don't think any of the disaster management plans had actually taken this into account and how it would pan out. So if you look at the growth projections which were there till last year, you could see a healthy growth. And all of a sudden, things have actually come to a stop. Not only a stop, they have gone into the reverse gear. And you see the economy is actually slowing down and reversing. Now, is this a phenomenon only in India? No. Actually, it has affected the global economy, but advanced economies much more than the developing economies. It appears that the developing economies appear to be more sustainable. There might be various reasons, I don't want to get into that, but the economic challenge that has been faced by all of us has taken us off guard. You know, India was slow to start with the port privatization. And when we say the maritime industry, it's not only the ships or the ports, it is much more where the cargo originates and cargo terminates. We used to have a saying before that the ports should wait for the ships and not the other way around. And as soon as the pandemic broke, there was chaos with the government locking down the system, and we didn't really know how to react because the guidelines that were being issued by the government and changing, there was a real difficult time that everybody faced in how to react to this pandemic because nobody had any experience. The last major pandemic which was there was Spanish flu, and I don't know many of the people who would actually be alive to talk about that flu and whether the maritime trade existed to these levels. So people were groping in the dark. People were trying to come up with their own ideas. People were looking to the government for understanding what it was all about. People were trying to react on how the government acted and so on and so forth. Eventually, what happened? The economies had started going down. Can you go to the next slide, please? See, if you look at the overall impact, now when we look at the overall impact, global trade slows down. But why has trade slowed down? Practically, if you divide the thing into three parts, it originated in China, spread to the European continent and the US very fast. It was very slow to hit India. So what actually happened was when Europe and the US were actually shutting down, India was still active. So most of the orders which were available at that point in time were still arriving in India, and India was slow to shut down. So initially you could actually see a lot of imports coming in, but the manpower was not there to handle because the government had issued various guidelines. So there was a lot of traffic fall in the ports, and you had to cater to that. The biggest problem that was faced was you did not have the people because people would come and go. So how to react and ensure the ports were sustainable in the times of crisis? Most of the ports did declare the force majeure, including the government, but the ports continued to function because the governments had declared the Essential Services Act for the ports. But declaring the Essential Services Act and getting the ports operational is one thing, but getting people to actually come and work in the port was another nightmare. So all in all, it was a struggle for the Indian maritime industry because ships were coming in, the people were not there. So it was a slow reaction, but over a period of 15 to 20 days, I think the people were able to get their acts together and understand that abnormal is going to be the new normal and it is here to stay, not for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, but at least for a year. Because the social media as it is today versus maybe 100 years back was completely different. So people have far more information on the social media are and are equally reactive rather than taking into account the ground realities, which might not have been so harsh, but this actually had a negative impact. So, though the global maritime industry, the ships kept on moving the high seas, it took them 30 days or maybe 45 days to sail. So the ships continued to sail, but as they start reaching the port, you had various instructions where to have a 14-day quarantine period or a 3-day quarantine period. So that clarity was not there. So eventually what happened, the port started getting congested and one had to really react fast on how to ensure that the ports could still accept the cargoes without getting choked. Exactly what you see in most of the toll booths on the expressways when you are moving around at 120 kilometers and suddenly the traffic comes to a grinding halt, and that is exactly what had happened to the entire port community. Because ships were flowing in, cargo was not able to move out, and what were the immediate steps that could be taken, because you didn't find the horizontal transportation up to the mark, and that created a lot of problems. Can you go to the next slide, please? See, most of the time, if you see, the people around think the maritime industry is only ships, but there is more to the maritime industry than the vessels. Because if the cargo has to originate at one place, it has to get consumed at the other place, and vice versa on the import and export side. So, what ships were actually afloat, they started arriving at the ports, and then the port storage evacuation became a problem because you could discharge the ships and getting the cargoes out was a problem. So, how did one really start dealing with it? Because of the pandemic, the trucks were off the highways. And when the trucks were off the highways, because there was a general panic across. So, how do you actually cater to a certain kind of pandemic? Because nobody, I repeat, nobody in the existing managerial position or the operational team members had ever experienced this kind of a disaster. People had disaster management plans in place for earthquakes, they had it for the tsunamis, they had it for torrential rains, they had it for strikes, they had all the scenarios that were possible on the paper. But nobody ever expected this kind of scenario to happen. So it was a learning and it was starting from scratch for everybody. So what did the government do? They kept the ports open. Little did they realize that ports would get choked, and unless the cargo was evacuated either on the import or export side, it would not really help. So the next best thing that the government actually did was rush the trains in and started evacuating the ports as fast as they could. And they really had to intervene. And when they did intervene, they started pushing the trains in actually free of cost on the empty runs, which is not the case really. But that helped the ports survive the first 45 days, and the entire logjam which would have occurred in the ports was actually shifted into the internal and container depots or the godowns or storages in the hinterland, and therefore ports could continue to function. Now, for the ports to continue to function, there are three primary reactions that the port had to do to ensure the marine, that is, you had the vessels berthing and unberthing on time. So you had to have the teams there. You had to have the people actually being able to load and discharge the ships the way they were doing, that was being done, and then actually evacuate the entire cargo that landed in the port so as not to choke the ports and cause a problem for the entire industry or the supply chain to be kept active. So there was a new thought process in the ports that if we are not able to get the people in into the ports on a daily basis because transportation was a problem, then how do you deal with it? The government did play a very active role in getting the trains in, but what about the people? The way the instructions were actually coming in from the government was a lot of mixed instructions. So, how best does one tackle this? And this learning came nearly 15 days to 30 days from the time the pandemic had started setting in India. And when did this happen? well, everybody took one decision that if we have to get the ports running, it is best that we are able to keep all the people who are essential and critical staying in the port, and then they start operating the port, although it would have been at a limited capacity, but that was the only option that was available. With the flexibility that the private ports enjoy, can you go to the next slide, please? As I said, with the flexibility that the private ports enjoyed, and we generally have been ahead of the curve. So the mantra that was used by the entire team at all our ports was abnormal is the new normal. Now, if we have to ensure that in the new normal, which is the abnormal, if we have to survive, what is it that we have to do? Now, if you look at the statutory requirements from the time you get the document clearance, it used to be the good old hard copy way. But we actually pushed the government to accept the digitization, which they readily did accept. Then we also realized that we also have to get our act together. We also have to ensure the workforce is geared for it, the technology is available, then the asset response, and last but not the least, but actually that was the top priority, how do you keep people safe when you are interacting with people who have visited foreign countries, when there is a suspicion that they might be COVID positive, and the way the pandemic spreads is just 6 feet away. So how do you actually keep your team members safe? That was the biggest challenge we had. But what we actually realized was it wasn't a very complex requirement of keeping people 6 feet away and wearing the face mask and the personal protective equipment. So till date, when we did practice that, we were off the block extremely fast. And at all the ports that we operated, we were able to continue operating at, I would say, 65% of the capacity, and we did not have a single positive case in the port, just for the simple reason that we took safety very, very seriously. Would we have been able to do this in a normal scenario? The answer was no. The entire team got up to the fact. The precautionary measures were very simple, but the way people react and the way you have to work in the ships or in the port, the proximity is required. But we did accept that abnormal being the new normal, we have to keep social distance and whatever it takes. So we in the private ports have been able to do this safely, keeping the social distance, ensuring people do not get affected, and trying to keep 65% occupancy along and productivity going. So this continued and it still continues today. Can you give me the next slide, please? Well, again, when you look at what all could we have done if we had known this, but when you look at the key takeaways, technology is required and it is here to stay. As much as the developing world might be behind the advanced nations, but technology does not recognize the developing versus the advanced. It is easy to replicate. It is only the mindset which has to change. And if one has to survive in today's world, we have to get that going. Digital technology is important, but we also have to understand in the maritime sector, unless the cargo physically moves, that is from the ship to the consumer and from the consumer back onto the ship for export, technology is there, it eases the paperwork, it also eases the people's movement from point A to point B. But fundamentally, the cargo has to move, and that physical aspect will continue to stay, whichever state we are in. Then there are multiple reasons which we can look at in how to actually move ahead in this abnormal is new normal. So you have multimodal logistics, then it's not only to thank the people on the hinterland, but it is also a must that we should thank the people out at sea who were unable to sign on and sign off and they were really getting frustrated because most of the countries had locked down their borders. There were no international flights. So you had the seafarers coming in, you had the seafarers going out. What is it that we could do to ensure that we could cheer the seafarers, to ensure that they gave productivity and handle the cargoes safely? So this is what we at the ports did. And this actually helped us because that's when the word got around that yes, these ports have accepted the normal and the abnormal and realized that abnormal is the new normal and that is the way to move around. In all this, could we have got a better deal the way government actually acted? I would say yes. Can we go to the next slide, please? See, government also was taken aback because most of the disaster management plans, I don't think this kind of a scenario was ever built into them. So they were seeing what was happening in the European subcontinent and in the US and other parts of the country, and we were reacting. We had the advantage of reacting, but in that reaction, a lot of mixed signals came. Now, to get over all those mixed signals, could the government have done better? Yes, the government could have done better, but the government is also slowly seized of the matter, and government has realized that yes, if we have to move ahead and we have to survive, and I would really put it across that the private ports has shown the way to the government because we have been actively involving the government across all the realistic scenarios that we wanted them to emulate. And on a daily basis, there used to be a war room created in the ports along with the government officials on how to improve the delivery mechanism on the import and export cycle and what is it that the government could do. And we were really surprised that government was extremely proactive because we would discuss something at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We would find the circular out the next day, and we managed to tide over this existing pandemic. I'm not saying the pandemic is over, but at least we have been able to get our act together. We have been able to sustain. Going forward, we are practically on an even keel. The ships are coming in, people are able to service the vessels, the crew has been able to sign on and sign off, and things have actually started getting back to normal. But I would not say that it's 100% normalcy. It is still at 65 to 75%. But with the government's help, yes, things are better, but they could have done something better. So could we have done something better had we known? But the entire generation that is there today, they will keep on discussing this in years to come. Did we do something right or could we have done something better? I'm not saying we have the best answers or any of the answers are right or wrong. I think that's left for the people to decide in the end once this pandemic is over what could have been done better, and that will go down in the history. Chapters will be written on the disaster management on how things could be done better, but be sure that most of the people who have been able to react and be proactive to this pandemic have actually come out winners. And I'm sure with the learning that everybody has, they will pick it up and they will be better geared for any future pandemic were it to arise. And hopefully nothing of this kind should happen. That's all from my side. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Captain Abhyankar, for a very exciting and insightful projection of what has been done right and what could have slightly been done better. The second question, which was put to the audience as a poll question, has come up with a balanced view or the opinion of the audience. Some of the people, like 75 out of 330, have said that the recovery is expected to be V-shaped. In the sense, the maritime industry will be the leader. On the other hand, more or less similar number, which is 73, which says that the maritime industry will be a laggard with broad U-shaped recovery post-pandemic session. Ultimately, it is the time which will tell. Probably we will take that as one of the questions from the experts. However, your insight in terms of being prepared for this kind of disaster will become a lesson for the future books or future theories on the DMPs and the different steps, especially to make the abnormal as the new normal, would definitely go a long way in making sure that number one, there is a fast-paced recovery. Number two, it becomes a permanent learning lesson for the future. Let us now turn to the last speaker for this session, Mr. Samir Bhatnagar, and he will take us through the rest of the session. However, before he starts, here is the next question for the audience poll. The question is, should the government and policymakers intervene to support maritime industry recover post future crisis and build the resilience? The options are fully support, limited support, or leave the industry to find its own solution. So please, you try and answer this question, because on the previous opinion polls, the responses have been approximately 50%, and we will definitely want some more responses to come in. I request Mr. Samir Bhatnagar to please take over.
Thank you, Mr. Parekh. Can we have the presentation? Thank you, everybody, and welcome to this session today. I would like to thank the organizers at AIIM and my co-speakers on the panel for giving an opportunity to present our views on the topic. It's something which is quite close to me professionally and personally, and happy to be speaking here. My presentation today would cover three aspects, which is impact of COVID-19 on seaborne trade, some of which has been covered by the previous speakers. Second is what are the domestic and international measures which have been undertaken. And lastly, the longer period of my presentation, which I would talk about the steps to build a resilient industry in India. I would probably keep my presentation for around 15 minutes, and we would be left with around 20 odd minutes for question answers from the audience. The next slide, please. So based on the data that we got from the Indian Ports Association, we do see a sharp decline at the major ports across the months of April and May. Captain Abhyankar talked about the immediate impact across March and April. But as of May, we see that on an average, we see a decline of close to 20% at the major ports across to cargo when we compare the cargo for FY19 and the relevant months of FY20. The next slide, please. And this trend is common and more or less secular across all the three categories, but we've seen a sharper dip at container traffic at the major ports. When we look at the non-major ports, they also have seen a decline of 20 to 25% of cargo in the similar periods, and that also when you take at an all in India basis, we find that traffic has dropped at 20 to 25%. There was a sharp drop between March and April. April and May, there was a relatively lesser drop. That takes into account as we understand the immediate impact of the lockdown which happened in India. And then subsequently, we believe that, as Captain Abhyankar was talking about, that ships are already on their way. So they were stalled while procedures and emergency procedures kicked in, and then trade settled to a certain level at which now it's continuing. The next slide, please. What we saw is the impact across the entire supply chain. Some of this has already been spoken. I would not spend too much time, but yes, very quickly we found that there were blank sailings or cancelled cruise calls specifically. There were delays because of sanitation-related issues, screening-related issues, and any other compliance checks. So there were delays in the entire supply chain. Again, Captain Abhyankar talked about the increase in the dwell time of cargo and the cargo turnaround time. Due to restriction and unavailability of drivers and labor, the evacuation from the hinterland to the hinterland and from the hinterland also suffered, which kind of ties in with the whole concept which was explained earlier, that maritime is not just about ports and shipping, but it is also about hinterland logistics right up to the doorstep of the customer. So the lack of availability of drivers did affect cargo evacuation, and there was a pileup of cargo. There were, of course, restriction on vessels, the crew testing, the crew changeovers, waste disposal approvals, and vessel quarantines happening. So there was it, and it still continues at places, and you can see stranded at different places. I'll not talk again about shortage of dock workers. I've talked about it across the entire value chain, and we found that when you talk about CFS capacity, specifically with respect to containers, then there was a lot of unclaimed cargo, importers unable to clear the cargo because even if they were to clear a box from the port of the CFS, the hinterland warehouses were not entirely open, or they had labor shortages at the hinterland. So even if a container moved out of the port, they did not know where do I take my cargo to because the warehouse was not open. Or I did not have trucks to take my cargo, de-stuffed cargo from the port CFS to somewhere in the hinterland. And from then onwards, the distribution channels were not entirely open, and there was an issue with the entire supply chain. So I think what I want to say is that there are certain economic impacts of the slowdown of trade, which Dr. Thierry also covered in his presentation when he talked about the sharp decline in trade having financial and commercial impacts. But on a process perspective, we found that supply chain elongated, and there was cargo pileup at different points in the chain. What this would mean is that on one side you had cargo drops happening, on the other side you had bottlenecks piling up, and that has created a significant imbalance along the supply chain at different asset points. And it would take time for these positions to unwind and come to an equilibrium, which would depend on how the bottlenecks are released at different points in the supply chain. Which brings me to the perspective of what was the response of the governments, both domestically and internationally. And I would like to go on to the next slide. Yes, next slide, please. So in India, I'm talking about three important things which were done by the Ministry of Shipping for the major ports, and three from the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs. So there were advisories sent out that there should not be detention or demurrage charges or penalty charges on cargo like unclaimed at the port. And we also understand that the MGTs might be recomputed, excluding the lockdown period and cargo volume handled. So these were advisories which were issued by the Ministry of Shipping. There were certain other advisories also issued, but I've just focused on 3 or 4 important ones as an example. So the Ministry of Shipping and the port authorities also responded to the situation which was emerging. There were things around allowing the port authorities to e-passes to allow the port staff from the CFS, CHS, etc. to come to the port and carry out operations. Sanitation measures extra being carried out, and other physical and facilitation measures like availability of buses for transportation of workers, etc. being carried out at the ports. Ports was declared as an emergency good and service. So they were operating, and hence the concept of keeping the ports open for business was an important institutional, or let's say policy directive taken, that ports will be declared an essential service and will be kept open. And for all operations, in contrast to aviation, where public passenger transport, commercial aviation was stopped and only air cargo operations continued. Customs, I think, while there were specific instances and instructions given out in a phase-wise manner, the importance is that the officers and the customs department did make themselves available, if not in person for inspections, but even on email and phone, to facilitate the clearance of cargo, and a lot of documents were cleared on an email basis, or were being cleared on an e-basis or on basis of digital documents. What I am aware of that in the time of the lockdown, there were significant industry interactions as well at different forums, and in these forums, various users talked about their problems, and the departments and the respective officers found solutions to it, including the ability to be available to address challenges of the user. So there have been instances where people have given approvals on email and WhatsApp, etc., to kind of facilitate the movement of cargo. I think overall there was a broad consensus and a cooperation that things should be evaluated quickly. Certain powers were delegated to the officers in order to facilitate the movement of cargo. It did happen in a timely or in a phased manner, not overnight, and it has progressed gradually as situations came up and they were resolved one by one. Could we go to the slide number 10, please? Next slide, please. Yes, I would not talk about on the international front. The United Nations is looking at a project to resilience in the transport and trade connectivity areas, and it will talk about solutions, standards, guidelines, tools, and methodologies which could be implemented by countries to have a global response. Because as Dr. Thierry talked about, that this is not or a local industry confined to a country. Maritime is a global industry, and any one part of the chain getting affected, one part of the world affects some other part of the world as well. And that's really where, when we talk about resilience, it's important that we talk about resilience not just at a country level. Well, that's good to do. It's also important that the entire chain is resilient across the world. And to that extent, the UN project is looking at bringing in a standard of resilience by focusing on contactless, seamless, and collaborative measures. So contactless is looking at basically going to a paperless digital method. Seamless is about having policies and procedures which are uniform across so that there is no stoppage of cargo or documentation and information flow. So even though you may have digital and paperless transactions, if the norms of the transactions and the customs procedures and barriers, non-tariff barriers, are different, the information could stop and require manual intervention for clearances, or cargo could again stop because there is it is not synchronous between what is coming from one agency to another agency. The handover has to be asynchronous. So that's what we talk about seamless. And the collaborative is how can people come together on a regional basis and cooperate and collaborate for operations. We shall talk about it when I talk about my first intervention about a logistics coordination group. But the third element is that having said this, on the documentation and the trade facilitation principles, we look at collaborative tools. So this is all encapsulated in the code from the United Nations. They are mentioned on my presentation about the ASCY, CUDA, the ETIR system, and various other standards that they're looking to develop and propagate across the world, that people tend to operate on one single standard and an automated standard for customs and trade across borders. So these are the initiatives which are being looked by the international community to look at building resilience at an international level. The next slide, please. So now I come to, as I had said, I'd probably spend a lot more time having given a quick aspect of what happened in India, how did our government respond. We'll now, and as I think Dr. Thierry also talked about, that he's traced the last 40 years almost of the international trade and economic growth community. And this is probably the sharpest decline in trade. But what that graph also showed is that this is not the first time that we've seen a sharp decline. The last one was just about 10 years ago with the GFR, and intermittently also we've seen certain shocks. What's interesting is to see that the frequency of these shocks is increasing, and the manner of these crises is also is varying. So right now we're talking about a medical pandemic. GFR was a financial economic condition. Few years back, we had an IT attack which led to a cybersecurity attack disrupting operations in one part of the world. It could happen again. So, and there could be complete, there are of course natural disasters. We had the tsunami disaster quite a few years back, which will affect again maritime trade and operations. So what we are seeing is, whether you talk about a natural disaster, you talk about a technology disaster, you talk about a medical disaster or an economic disaster, these could come from anywhere. And being an extremely close, connected supply chain, which has been brought about by the greater globalization and supply chain integration, it also brings in greater challenges when building resilience. Earlier, when supply chains were more distinct across countries and were more discrete, a change in one part did not necessarily change another part of the supply chain or another country because they were not tightly coupled. But now we find that because of the tight coupling, the impact in one part of the chain is affecting somewhere else in the globe. And hence, it's important that even within the country, because the maritime is not just the port but the interline logistics, you need to ensure that the entire chain of transporters, CHAs, CFAs, etc., cargo owners, etc., trucking, warehousing industry all comes together on a single platform. Next slide, please. So I will talk about three important elements, which is a logistics coordination group, specifically made for crisis management, digitization across the value chain. Captain Abhyankar stressed upon this quite extensively. So I'll briefly touch upon that, but I would probably focus on the fund creation, on innovation and technology. That is really, when we talk about automation and development, as we've seen in the leading ports, especially in Antwerp, where they've got an accelerator program, a lot of innovation around technology applications. How do we kind of bring that in the country as well, so that the kind of initiatives which are thought about by the industry can actually come to fruition and can actually be actuated. Next slide, please. So I think the first step that we said is that yes, we have automation and processes, but the biggest challenge with crisis is that they could be in any form, and it may not just be difficult for us to predict. And while again, Captain Abhyankar talked about that most business continuity plans did not envisage something like this. So while a lot of physical systems and IT systems and people may have continuity plans and they may or may not have activated it, it's very much likely that the next situation may be such in which the continuity plans may not be entirely effective. And that's where human innovation comes to mind. And that's really where we talk about that finally people have to come together to make this work. And that's why we one of the ideas we're talking about is about creating a logistics coordination group where the government and the private sector work together to kind of create a group which can actually be used as an emergency response and a logistics coordination response group in the case of a crisis. It can be institutionally established by incorporating people across the entire value chain of logistics. Like I mentioned, I attended some webinars and events in the earlier part of the lockdown in April, and I listened to the way problems came up and then solutions are found. It all comes because of collective collaborative thinking, and that's really the role of this group. We've looked at 7 terms of reference for this group. First is that they could meet every quarter or every 6 months to look at what is the state of preparedness. Do they foresee any major risks to the industry, and what is the preparation of the industry and how things are happening? The second is to look at interagency contingency planning, so that they can say that yes, is our logistics ready to take care of any logistics and plan for any resource allocation, or in terms of how the systems and processes are organized. The third is to develop protocol. What happens when you have a crisis situation coming up? Then what should be the protocols and how do these get triggered? Fourth and fifth is about collaboration and cooperation between transport assets. That yes, even if I'm having a problem and tomorrow one of my facilities or assets in a part of the country is affected, can I lean upon or borrow my assets from maybe a competitor also possibly, or some other actor in the supply chain, and use those assets to ensure that my asset is operationalized, or even if my asset is not operationalized, am I meeting the the requirements of the end consumer? So in times of crisis and disaster, collaboration of assets between competitors may actually be a very good initiative to be done. And if it is rooted through a group like this, it could at least trigger those protocols of sharing of contingent resources. 6 and 7 is really about driving down. Ours is a very large country, extremely diverse, from coastal regions to deserts to hills and to areas which are well connected by road network, areas which are well connected by railway network. Quite challenging to control all the ground level issues from one single place in the center. Good to have small regional cells who would have a better understanding of the regional economics and people cultural issues to activate a disaster response. And finally, it's about knowledge sharing. Good practices seen in some other industries, how they have responded to crisis, maybe some learnings in some other part of the world which might be facing a crisis, what has come out of it would be an important forum so that the knowledge and logic is actually captured by this group and translated into processes and technology down the line. Next slide, please. We've talked about automation and digitization. I'll just spend a quick minute. This is from the World Economic Forum's Logistics Internet's framework. This is talking about border interoperability. We're talking about having a single system for a global trade identity, or identity could actually trade across the world with a single technology identity. There is visibility of certain elements across the chain so that assets and flows can be made more visible and you can plan your operations much better. That is all the more critical in a crisis situation. It's when you have information, you can respond better. If you don't have information, you really don't know what to do, and it all helps if you can have visibility on not just on your assets, but also on competitor assets and collaborative assets and other vendor assets. So you can look at alternate innovative solutions. And also look at not really digital currencies, which I mean digital currencies. We talk about use of more online flows, etc., to ease the flow of credit, to ease the flow of financials across, so that livelihoods, etc., are not affected across the whole supply chain. So this is really going to the next level in terms of identifying that there are 4 or 5 core technologies that the maritime industry today is talking about. There is big data. We're talking about automation for operational efficiency, blockchain to ensure or facilitate certified and validated and authenticated transfers of information and documents, and IoTs to give you last mile information and fine-tuned information in the most accurate, dynamic, and authentic manner as possible. So we've kind of mapped where some of these technologies could be used in which parts of the entire supply chain. So this is really about how do you use technology to bring more resilience. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think we can skip this slide. We'd like to go to the next slide in the interest of time. Yes. We've taken this suggestion from the Mint Fund set up by the Port of Singapore Authority, which is to support research and development in the area of innovation of maritime technologies. And they work across various R&D projects, automation, marine environment, sustainability, port operations, automation, and also on data analytics, modeling, and simulation. So what is it that we can do in India? The next slide, please. So I looked at, once we've got technology, where is it that we can use it, right? So we've looked at 3 important areas: data analytics, modeling and simulation, and automation. I'll start with the last one. First, automation is about ensuring that in case of disasters and crises, machines can keep working and cargo operations can continue. And it's a lot more important if you have human, unsafe, and inaccessible areas. So in places, let's say, where it would be very, very useful that if your people cannot travel or you do not have sufficient people to go because it's an unsafe operational area, how can you send drones or robos, underwater drones, etc., to ensure that, let's suppose there's a ship disaster which has happened, how you can send underwater drones to kind of see what the damage to the ship is, etc., visualize it, and try and repair it underwater without sending humans there, which could be unsafe or inaccessible to humans. Or let's say the motors are installed at the top of gantry cranes, etc. So to use automation and such a drones, etc., to kind of improve and bring equipment back to life and operations. Modeling and simulation is really about using a lot of technology and models to simulate disaster situations of what could happen, anticipate what the risks are, and also to stress test your system that in case something goes out of bounds, then how is it that your IT and your process and operations work, and also to simulate that in case we have IT failures, like I said, if you have a virus attack and you become extremely, extremely digital, The biggest downside to use of technology and digitization is that you may actually have a virus which might cripple all your systems. That one when you may switch to manual. So how do you kind of model and simulate that? The last is, of course, data analytics is really about understanding what the supply chain is, uh, better forecasting of potential risks, understanding where your systems are under stress, and looking at how we can look at allocating manpower and more dynamic allocation of resources to respond to the difficult situations at hand. So analytics, modeling and simulation of future situations, analyzing historical lessons, and automation. How can it be made more specific to specifically address resilience? And to develop these areas which are fast coming, we have a good talent of engineers and manpower and talent in the country, but a fund which is focusing on these areas is something which could be taken up jointly and to develop this and build resilience. So that's the last of my slide. Thank you very much for listening in, and happy to take questions from the audience and from the panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Samir Bhatnagar. It was very enlightening, and we will straight away go into the questions. A large number of questions have come in from the audience through various medium that this webinar is being telecast live. The first question is to Dr. Thierry to please tell us what do you see as the long-term trends as the impact of the present COVID-19 pandemic recedes? The long-term trend for the maritime industry.
Okay. Well, of course, it's a bit early on still because we are still in the full middle of this pandemic, and we all know the longer it will last, the longer the effects will also last in our behavior, also in respect to trade and international shipping. But what we can assume already is that countries and continents will try to be less dependent on, let's say, the classical producing countries. We've seen, especially even for urgent health material now, many continents, many countries depend to a high extent on China, for instance, and on Asia more broadly. I would expect that we will see a shift more towards nearshoring. That means producing things, especially essential goods, closer to home. And that would have an impact on shipping, of course, because it would mean less cross-continental shipping and more intracontinental shipping, most likely. So this is one of the things that I see happening. It was, in fact, already a bit happening before the pandemic. And I think now with the pandemic, it will actually be strongly reinforced. So we expect to see more of this replacing the cross-continental shipping by intracontinental shipping, short sea shipping, and similar types of shipping.
That means the ton-mile demand may go down for as far as the shipping tonnage is required. So the next question is the technology. This is actually addressed to both Captain Abhyankar and Dr. Thierry. I would now request Captain Abhyankar to take on this question as to what advice can you give to those who are trying to catch up with the digital development in the shipping?
Well, we have to first understand in shipping, cargo moves physically, that it has to be loaded and it has to be unloaded and it has to be physically transported. Because I've been asked this question many times, how does technology actually disrupt shipping? The physical movement of cargo does not get disrupted. What actually gets disrupted is the use of technology to move the documentation in and out, to get the vessel's parameters in and out, to ensure that people are not dependent on anything physical. So how seamless can we get the documentation from point A to point B, that is right from a load port to a discharge port or a vice versa? The faster we are, that is what technology can really affect. Second part of the technology that can affect, and on the ship side or on the port side, is what Dr. Thierry had shown, is automated terminals. Now, automated terminals have their relevance, it depends on the cost of the automated terminals. I remember we had done a study in India, and based on the Indian wage bill versus the European wage bill, the technology is there, technology can easily be adapted, but the issue is what is the payback period? Now, on a high wage industry like Europe and the US or other countries which are very well developed versus the developing countries where the wage bill isn't that high, where you don't have a payback period. So it is actually the commercials which guide the use of technology. Technology is available and technology can be used, but eventually it tends to be a commercial decision on what is the cheapest form of communication, whether on the movement of cargo, but on movement of documents and communication, I would say technology adaptation is there to stay, whether it's a developed nation or a developing nation or practically anywhere. So that is what I have an answer for technological adaptation for the maritime industry.
Thank you, Abhyankar. The question, well, it is not meant for you, but I will now put it to Mr. Samir Bhatnagar. How can the imbalance in the trade be handled, especially with respect to the integration of port and ICD, when you want to have a seamless stream of the chain?
Could you
Imbalance in the trade.
could you just repeat the second part of the question, Mr. Parekh? I heard that. How do you correct the imbalance in trade? Sorry.
How do you handle the imbalance of the trade, especially with respect to the integration of the port and the ICs? If it is not clear, probably Captain Abhyankar will highlight on this.
I'm not sure if I've understood the question correctly, but I mentioned about the change in the trade patterns given the crisis in the industry and the imbalance which has happened because of the pandemic.
The seamless transit for the entire chain, and no longer it is limited only as a port-to-port movement. So there will be regional imbalances which will be created. How do you handle those?
I don't think so. There is an easy answer for handling regional trade imbalances. And it is actually driven by economics. So it will take its time, like I said, to unwind the positions which are built up. It also depends on how and where the different countries enact policies to facilitate the recovery of the economies. And as economies recover and there's a demand for goods, as Dr. Thierry also explained that people are anticipating a slowdown in their income, so they're reducing discretionary expenditure. So we do see the trade slow down, but it is, as we've seen with previous crises, trade positions will gradually unwind and the goods will move to the end consumer over a period of time. But it's not something which is really in the hands of any one player or any one country. So it would take time to unwind, but it's dependent significantly on regional policies.
Thank you. The next question is for Dr. Thierry, which is in two parts. One is, how do you see the recovery at the European ports? And the second part is, what are the actions or the recent initiatives which are taken by the European ports to accelerate the recovery process?
Yes, well, first of all, I must say that as such, the European ports mainly have not suffered that much, in the sense that there has been no real lockdown in the ports. Procedures have been adapted very quickly in the ports so that they could keep on functioning. So there was nearly no delay in that. We have seen no real slowdown in those activities as such. The only problem is, of course, on the demand side. that indeed less ships were and still are coming in, and that will continue for a while. Plus, there is the customer side, the people that have to buy products in the end, in the hinterland, let's say. As long as there is no full confidence again in a stable health situation and a stable economy, their purchases will remain below or even far below what they used to be before. People will keep on postponing things they want to buy, etc. And that will be one of the huge impacts. And this is one of the big things that now these European ports have to cope with, namely products, goods are coming in, they pile up in the ports, but nobody, well, that's extreme of course, but much less than before, people want to buy these goods. That means the stocks remain in the ports, the containers remain full in the ports and nobody is picking them up. And that's one of the big issues. I don't think it's something that ports can do something about. I think it's mainly a role for public authorities, for governments to see how to stimulate the economy again, but in the first place, of course, to bring back a stable health situation, because as long as that is not there, people will have no confidence that the economy will not fall down and they will not buying like they did before. So I think that's a major role for the government to keep the health situation under control and at the same time stimulate and heavily stimulate most likely then the economy also. And one does not go without the other. There's no point in stimulating the economy financially if the health situation is not under control. I mean, you will not make people buy goods if they have no confidence that they will still have a job in a few months' time because of the health situation also. So that's the big point that governments have to solve, I think.
One draws some lessons from the example of Sweden. The next question is for Captain Unmesh Abhyankar. How do you see the impact of COVID on the transshipment ports versus the traditional cargo ports? Similarly, the impact on intra-country versus inter-country cargo movements.
Well, let me first answer the transshipment. The transshipment ports have the way the name or nomenclature of the port is, they're actually transshipping cargo from one point to another. Now, when you look at the overall trade movement from point A to point B, if the trade movement has actually slowed down, then the shipping lines, but natural, will take a call on how much of transshipment volumes to dump in a particular port, or to actually skip particular transshipment ports and concentrate on the more economical ones. So transshipment fundamentally is a function of the end consumption, and it is just an intermediary on the hub and spoke arrangement. Now, the second question that you had raised on how do you see the movement of goods from point A to point B? Eventually, again, as I said, first, if people have to get over the pandemic, that is when they will have confidence. And as Dr. Thierry rightly put it, that the government can give in a lot of impetus into the economy, they can pump in a lot of cash. But unless people have the confidence of actually surviving the pandemic, it will be difficult for people to go and buy. So overall trade will definitely be impacted. The quantum, even I don't know today, but primarily what moves in the containers is finished goods, but other bulk liquids or bulk solids, they are fundamental to any economy. So that movement will continue, maybe not to that great extent, that there will definitely be a slowdown. So health comes first, and once that is clear, then the stimulus will actually start kicking in and start paying dividends. But initially, as things stand today, people are more concerned about the health and whether they're going to continue with the jobs that they have in the future. If this really goes up and up and up and stays for the next 6 months or so, which nobody is really clear about.
Probably this will be the last question of the day, and I will request a simple answer from all three of you, sirs. it is though addressed to Captain Abhyankar, I would request inputs from all the three of you. Can you please share a few best practices which are followed from the ports in Dubai, Singapore, etc.? So let's start with Mr. Samir Bhatnagar and then take on the other two speakers.
Well, for me, the short and easy answer is I had a slide which talked about the Mint Fund in Singapore. So it's already there where they are running regular contests to identify startups and promote the usage of technology. And that's something which I would say is a good practice I've seen from the port of Singapore. And what I see in the case of Dubai is the close integration that the port has with the free zone in Jafza, and the way that they've looked at not just the port, but the free zone and the trading ecosystem which is there. For them, the port is not just a gateway for handling cargo, but it's a business ecosystem. I think these are the two examples I could lay from there from an economic and a business environment perspective.
Across the world.
If I may add to that one, what I would like to say is indeed we have very good examples in Singapore and in Dubai, for instance. By the way, these terminal operators over there are active globally also. I mean, look at PSA, look at DP World. So that means their innovation also spreads out globally. And that's what we also see in ports, also in Europe, for instance. We see that in Antwerp, in Rotterdam. So I think there too we have good practices of rolling out innovation, create a real innovative ecosystem around the port. One thing I would like to mention though is, don't be mistaken, this is all very important and crucial and needed. But in the end, it's all about cargo. And that's something that some innovators in the end seem to forget about. I mean, they seem to be so much into innovation, which is fully correct, that in the end still cargo has to flow through these ports. And that's what is sometimes forgotten, I have the impression.
Thank you, Dr. Thierry. Captain Abhyankar, can I have the last words?
Well, what Dr. Thierry and Samir rightly put it, you got the best practices, but let me put it very, very short and sweet. The faster that the container can get off the ship and move to the customer, the faster the consumer will be happier, the lesser will be the economic burden, the lesser will be your logistics cost. Whether it's Singapore, Dubai, that is the mantra which you get practiced across.
Okay, with that, I thank all the panelists for a very, very exciting and insightful session in addressing to this active and interested audience, and we look forward to even bigger and greater support from all of you. The recording of this will be made available, and please keep in touch, and for any questions you please feel free to write to the institute. We will be happy to support and assist in any possible manner. So thank you very much again for your active participation to Dr. Thierry, Captain Abhyankar and Mr. Samir Bhatnagar. And thank you very much to the organizers, and I especially thank the backup team who has put in a lot of efforts to bring this webinar to you in a seamless possible manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mukesh.